In the past couple of weeks, Russia has seriously escalated its aggression towards Europe. In mid-September, 19 Russian drones flew into Polish airspace, forcing NATO to scramble aircraft to shoot down at least 3. A few days later, Russian drones were spotted over Romania. Then, last Friday, 3 Russian fighter jets flew into Estonian airspace. On Sunday, Russian military aircraft were intercepted by German jets over the Baltic Sea. And on Monday, suspected Russian drones were spotted over Denmark and Norway's main airports, forcing them to close. All of these incidents have increased the pressure on NATO to respond, with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk confirming that from now on, Poland will shoot down flying objects without discussion when they violate our territory. Moreover, at the UN this week, US President Donald Trump also said that he thinks NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft that violate its airspace. So in this video, we'll take a look at the recent escalations in Russia-NATO tensions, and whether we could actually be on the cusp of a Russia-NATO war. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine Too Long. Yep, we make a real physical magazine. In the latest issue, we discuss if Europe can really defend itself, why people like Putin get away with it, and whether we're observing the end of the American order. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. First, let's summarize the recent events in Europe. A little over 2 weeks ago, on the 9th of September, at least 19 Russian drones flew into Polish airspace, several of which were shot down by NATO forces. This happened just before Russia's planned Zapad military drills in Belarus, which involved around 13,000 troops training to use Russia's Oreshnik missile system, which is capable of carrying nuclear warheads and is scheduled for delivery to Belarus by the end of 2025. Anyway, during the drills, Poland, Lithuania and Latvia imposed partial airspace closures in case Russian drones or aircraft entered their airspace and needed to be shot down. And also, Poland deployed 40,000 troops to its eastern border with Belarus. After the Russian drone incursion, Poland invoked NATO's Article 4 to request consultations between NATO members. Following the talks, on the 12th of September, NATO launched its new Eastern Century military operation, which saw France, Germany, Denmark and the UK send fighter jets to Eastern Europe for a collective aerial defence effort. The Eastern Century mission builds on NATO's pre-existing Baltic strategy and is intended to gradually expand aerial defence from the Arctic to the north of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean in the south. However, last Friday, the 19th of September, another more serious violation of NATO airspace occurred, when 3 MiG-31 fighter jets flew over Estonia, spending 12 minutes there before eventually encountering Italian jets and turning around. The incident reminded some observers of an incursion into Turkish airspace in 2012 by a Russian fighter jet, which was shot down after just 17 seconds. And since then, Russia hasn't tried again. This led some commentators to wonder why it took Europe so long to respond to Russian jets over Estonia last week. Now, it was obviously because NATO wants to avoid risking a war with Russia if it can, but also because, unlike Turkey, Estonia doesn't have its own fighter jet, so it can't make a national decision. Instead, it has to go through NATO, as well as the Italian government, whose jets were on patrol. Anyway, this week at the UN, Poland's foreign minister announced that Poland would shoot down any Russian aircraft that entered its airspace without permission, deliberately or by mistake. Trump also agreed with this, saying that NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft that violate NATO airspace. When asked to clarify whether the US would support NATO if it engaged Russian planes, Trump said it depends on the circumstance, but added, "We are very strong toward NATO." Trump has also pivoted on the Ukraine war, saying in a Truth Social post on Tuesday, "I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form." He also added that with the financial support of NATO, the original borders are very much an option. This has led some commentators to ask, is Russia already at war with NATO? Well, Russia is clearly engaged in what we might call a hybrid or grey zone campaign against NATO, using tactics like drones, sabotage, and cyber attacks. But in the sense that NATO still seems to define an armed attack, which is what's required to trigger the alliance's Article 5 mutual defence clause, as a ground invasion, then obviously no. But exploiting the ambiguity around what exactly constitutes an armed attack, a strategy the media often refers to as Russia testing NATO, seems to be exactly the Kremlin's plan. We actually made a video about the ambiguity surrounding NATO's Article 5 last week, which we've linked in the description. But essentially, Russia is trying to weaken NATO from within by creating disagreements between member states over how to respond to things like drones and airspace violations. You can imagine Poland or Estonia, for instance, demanding a strong reaction to some sort of territorial violation, but Trump being unwilling to risk war with another nuclear power over what he might see as just a bit of Eastern Europe. At the same time, Russia is apparently laying the rhetorical groundwork among its own population for a war with NATO, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov claiming last week that NATO is at war with Russia. Of course, there are lots of reasons to think that a war with NATO would be a bad idea for Russia. After all, if Russia is struggling in eastern Ukraine, then what makes Putin think he could take Estonia too, let alone Poland? But if the Kremlin thinks that a war with NATO is ultimately inevitable, they might have nonetheless decided that now is their best shot. Russia's economy and society is already geared for war. Trump isn't wholly committed to Ukraine, and while most European countries have pledged to increase defense spending, these new investments won't pay off for some time. Anyway, so far NATO's main response has been to ramp up their air defenses on Europe's eastern borders. This both makes NATO more able to defend against Russian aggression, but also reduces the risk of intra-NATO disagreements. If Russian drones can't get into European territory, then there is less likely to be a disagreement over how to respond when one does land in, say, Poland or the Baltics. To this end, today, Friday 26th, EU countries including Bulgaria, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania and also Denmark are holding talks with the EU's Defence Commissioner, Andrius Kubilius, about building a drone wall. A drone defence system using radar, cameras and existing anti-missile systems along the EU's eastern flank to deter Russia from drone violations and respond rapidly if they do happen. Ukraine, which has rapidly developed its own drone manufacturing capabilities during its war with Russia, is also joining the project. This is obviously a good idea, but NATO needs to make sure that this so-called drone wall is up and running as soon as possible, as the immediate risk is that Russia increases the frequency of its drone attacks to squeeze in as many as it can before the drone wall is up. The media landscape right now is moving so fast that it's quite easy to rely on just the information you already know, or the sources you've grown to trust. But what about everything you don't see? Or what if those sources you trust aren't completely honest? Well, luckily our sponsor this week, Ground News, are experts at lifting the veil on media bias. Their website and app, developed by a former NASA engineer, collects thousands of articles from across the media landscape, putting them all into one place for you to easily compare how the news is being covered around the world. For example, this story on Trump saying that he believes that Ukraine can win back all of its territory with NATO's help has been covered by 509 sources, with 92 reported by the left and 83 reported by the right. That's not all though, as Ground News offers a bunch of super handy features. We especially like their blind spot feed, as here you can see stories that have been disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean right, you might have missed this story about Trump slamming ABC for bringing back Jimmy Kimmel. It's important to know exactly what's circulating online in different echo chambers, instead of purposely choosing to stay in the dark. We all know that the current media sphere is always trying to get your attention by any means necessary, to sway you into thinking one thing or another. So having a website that helps you spot when that's happening is a real game changer. So if you're interested in staying on top of the news and trying everything that Ground News has to offer, then you can get a 40% off the unlimited Vantage Plan subscription by using the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. This limited time offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.